Okay, hi, so welcome to this second video about Prismatic Jane Eyre, close reading, a world novel across languages. There's an introductory video to the book as a whole, which you may have seen already, and what this is the first of a series of little talks that give you a fuller taste of what's inside the book. So some of them are by me and others of them are by my co-authors. So this talk is going to cover the introduction and chapters 1 and 2. The book has a somewhat unusual structure in that there's a series of what we call chapters, all of which are written by me, which pursue a general and continuous argument throughout the book. And these chapters are interspersed with a series of essays written by my co-authors, which focus on particular issues or context. So, for instance, in let's call it the first phase of the book, there's my introduction and chapters 1 and 2. And they're followed by essays 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you get chapter 3, which is followed by essays 5, 6, 7, and so on. And so that's what lies ahead, this series of chapters interspersed with a series of essays, 8 chapters and 17 essays. Let's go back to the beginning then, the introduction and chapters 1 and 2. The introduction is quite short, and it just says 3 main things. The first is that when we're dealing with something as vast as what I call the world work Jane Eyre, that is Jane Eyre as constituted by the source text and all its more than 600 translations together, you have to collaborate. So Prismatic Jane Eyre is the result of a collaborative endeavour. The second thing is that this has to be a very interactive kind of collaboration. Let me explain. One way of setting about this project would have been for me to create a kind of template for what was required from the other participants, saying what kind of information I wanted to be gathered about each translation, what kind of reading I wanted them to undertake. And that would have given, a sort of consistent encyclopedia-like result. But that approach, I think, would also have been seriously wrong for 2 reasons. The first is that it would have assumed that you know what you're going to discover before you discover it, whereas obviously the whole point of doing research is that you discover stuff that's new. And throughout the project, we all discovered things that we hadn't known in advance were going to be interesting. The book's full of them. The other reason why a top-down approach would have been wrong is that it would have imposed a single point of view on this astonishingly varied body of material. And that would have been an Anglo-centric and finally a colonial way of creating and structuring the knowledge in the book. So instead, what we did was recognise that each participant in the project is themselves a kind of translator. They discover for themselves what's interesting in the material they're looking at. They write about it in their own voice and they bring that into the volume. And my role then is, as it were, to try to speak on behalf of this collective, to be the conductor of this conversation. The next point in the introduction is that this has a consequence for how you as a reader approach the book. The book is a textual environment for you to explore. And the interactive digital maps and the digital verbal animations are very much part of that idea, because you can go into these interactive texts and explore them however you like. So this book then does not contain a phenomenon, because that phenomenon, the prismatic world work Jane Eyre, is too big. Instead, it opens onto it. And this, I think, is something that reading and understanding in a world literary context, that's to say a multilingual, multicultural, transnational context, reading and understanding in that sort of context always needs to recognise this fact. You can only ever see part of the phenomenon that interests you, and you're looking at it from a necessarily limited perspective. Okay, so that's the introduction. And now for chapter 1, which is called Prismatic Translation and Jane Eyre as a World Work. The chapter starts by chronicling the very many ways in which Jane Eyre has been remade and responded to in literary and critical history. There are lots of books that are influenced by Jane Eyre. There are continuations, prequels, film versions, TV versions, manga versions, blogs, fan fictions, and so on. And there are also lots of critical interpretations. And generally, I think people recognise that this ongoing critical and imaginative life associated with the book changes what the book is. For instance, a powerful new critical interpretation can make the novel look different. It can make people read it differently and therefore change what it is. And I think, I think that's sort of widely recognised, that that's something that happens. The argument I make then is that translation should be seen in the same way. Translations are very detailed reimaginings and critical interpretations, and they change the work by rewriting it. That means people who know Jane Eyre in English should also be interested by translations into other languages for similar reasons to why they might be interested in a new critical interpretation or a new TV version, to discover something more of what the novel can be. If we accept this idea, we're left with a question though, which is how do we distinguish between a translation and a TV adaptation, or a critical interpretation, or a freer kind of rewritten version of the novel? Aren't all these kinds of rewritings and remakings, aren't they all in a loose sense kinds of translation? Well, in a loose sense they are, but it still makes sense, I think, to draw a line between what we're calling translations for the purposes of this project and those freer kinds of rewriting and response. And the reason is that translations stake a particular kind of claim on the source text, on Jane Eyre. They claim to be it in another language. This is what in a book I did a few years ago called Prismatic Translation, I called the paradox of translation. Translations are obviously different from their source texts. Every word is different. And yet still paradoxically, they present themselves as being that text. So for the purposes of this project, Prismatic Jane Eyre, what we call translations are texts that stake that claim. That's to say, they announce themselves as being Jane Eyre in a new language. Of course, there are some exceptions and some details to this argument, which you'll find when you read the chapter. Then I look at an example, an abridged translation of Jane Eyre into French, serialised in a newspaper in Paris in 1849, so very soon after the book's publication in English 2 years earlier. This French version is then translated into Spanish and published in Chile, Cuba and Bolivia over the next year or two. And I then go into some detail about the kinds of reimagining and transformation that are involved in that process and the reasons for them. The main theoretical point that emerges from this discussion is that we have to see Jane Eyre, or any book in a world literary context, as being constituted by the source text and all the translations together. Every translation is different. This is part of what I use the term prismatic translation to kind of point to. And this difference is not fundamentally a matter of error or loss. It is fundamentally a matter of creative change, of the realization of potentials latent in the source text that manifest themselves differently through the imaginations of different translators working with different linguistic resources in different contexts. So Jane Eyre as a world work is made up of all these manifestations together. But how can you grasp this enormous and multilingual phenomenon? How can you read it? Well, you can explore aspects of it, and that's what happens in the essays by my co-authors and some parts of the work I've done in the book. But you can also try to get a sense of the mode of existence of this multilingual world work as a whole by tracking particular key words through many translations and visualizing them in multilingual animations and printed arrays. And I'll say more about this in a later video when I talk about chapters 4 to 8. Okay, that's brought us to the end of chapter 1. I'll now say a bit about chapter 2, which is called The World Work in Languages. And that is languages with brackets around the S. And the reason why there are brackets around the S is that there's a sense in which all of language is just one continuum. So there aren't plural languages, there is just a continuum of difference. What have been defined as different languages are areas of this continuum that have been, as it were, gathered together through people's usage, and then often standardized by political forces, including regimes of print and systems of education. Now, all the translations of Jane Eyre that we've looked at are printed, and they've therefore been done into, actually for the most part, they've been done into fairly standardized versions of languages. But those languages are, of course, also always changing, as languages do, and occasionally they mingle or split apart. Sometimes they're given different names. And I give a bit of a sense of this fluidity in chapter 2 by looking at a series of translations that are printed as being in Italian, but whose language overlaps with French to varying degrees. So in any translation, there's a tension between, on the one hand, the need to conform to the conventions of the standard language that the translation is, as it were, kind of officially being done into, and on the other hand, the possibility of being individual and different, the possibility for an individual translator's voice, distinctive kinds of language to come through, for instance, dialectal features, a distinctive style. There's always a possibility for kind of innovation and distinctiveness to coexist with this kind of regime of standardized language. So I then take this idea of this kind of tension or coexistence and bring it into a reading of the language that Charlotte Brontë herself wrote. And you might think that that was simply English, but in fact, Charlotte Brontë had a much more complex linguistic repertoire. Now, repertoire is the term that linguists use for all the kind of communicative resources that you have available to you. So you might have you might have a range of knowledge of different kinds of language in different contexts, different dialects and so on. And that's all part of your repertoire that you can use to express yourself. So Charlotte Brontë had a more complex repertoire than just English. I mean, it included a lot of standard English, of course, but it also included French, some German, and Yorkshire language. And you can see this in the texture of Jane Eyre. It's written with a very varied language repertoire. What's odd, though, is that the character Jane, as she grows up through this language environment that's created for her by the novel, she has a more strict conception of language difference than the novel itself seems to. So Jane as a character longs to learn foreign languages such as French and German, and she does learn them. And actually the novel includes several moments where Jane either desires to be able to translate or is involved in translating. On the other hand, though, she's also scared of unregulated language difference. So, for instance, when she's working as a teacher towards the end of the book, and she's teaching Yorkshire girls, and she wants to teach them to speak proper standard English rather than the dialect that they're speaking when she encounters them. And another instance is that the language that's used by Mr. Rochester's wife, Bertha, who's from the West Indies, she utters. And the language that she uses is so challenging to Jane that she cannot even accept it as being language. She can't represent Bertha as speaking language, even though we know from other parts of the book that Bertha does speak, though we can't be sure what language she uses. So this personal, social, and political dynamic of interaction between forces of standardization in language and forces of innovation and difference is already there in Bronte's text. And what I say towards the end of chapter 2 is that this plays out in all sorts of different interesting ways in the many translations. And that's where chapter 2 ends. So in the book, there's then a series of essays by my co-authors, after which there's chapter 3. And I'll tell you about chapter 3 in the next video.